Welcome back to XRP Update. Today's update starts with something that most investors are completely overlooking, but it could be one of the biggest clues yet about where XRP and the entire digital asset industry are heading next. Because while most people are focused on short-term price action, Ripple has been quietly building for the future. And not just the next bull market, not just the next year, the future of finance itself. Here's what happened. RippleX Chief Engineer Mayuka Vadari recently revealed that Ripple developers have been working since 2024 on strengthening the XRP Ledger against future quantum computing threats. Now, at first glance, that may sound like a highly technical update that only developers care about. But when you really think about it, this tells us something much bigger. Because companies don't spend years preparing for technology they don't believe is coming. They don't invest resources solving problems that they don't expect to face. So the real question becomes, why is Ripple preparing the XRP Ledger for a quantum future? Why are they focusing on privacy upgrades? Why are they expanding real-world asset tokenization? Why are they continuing to improve decentralized finance capabilities? The answer may be staring us right in the face, because they know exactly where the industry is heading, and they're preparing the XRP Ledger for the next generation of finance before the rest of the world gets there. Think about it. If real-world assets were never going to be tokenized, there would be no reason to build enhanced tokenization infrastructure. If decentralized finance wasn't going to become a major part of the financial system, there would be no reason to improve DeFi functionality. If privacy and digital identity solutions weren't important for the future economy, there would be no reason to continue developing those capabilities. But that's exactly what's happening. And for long-term XRP holders, these are the kinds of developments that matter far more than daily market volatility. Because while headlines change every day, infrastructure tells the real story. The breadcrumbs are everywhere, and each new development seems to point in the same direction. A future where blockchain technology becomes deeply integrated into the global financial system. Now think about the scale of what we're talking about. Real estate, stocks, bonds, debt markets, ownership records, business contracts, financial settlements. Many experts believe these assets will eventually move onto blockchain networks. Not because it's trendy, but because it's faster, more efficient, more transparent, and significantly less expensive than many traditional systems. That's why major institutions continue talking about tokenization. BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, and many other financial giants are already discussing how tokenized assets could transform global markets. And if that future becomes reality, the opportunity could be enormous. Because we're not talking about billions of dollars, we're talking about trillions, potentially hundreds of trillions of dollars in assets eventually moving into blockchain-based systems. That's why regulatory clarity remains such an important conversation. Because institutions need clear rules before they commit capital at scale. And many investors believe legislation like the Clarity Act could become one of the biggest catalysts for adoption, not because regulations magically create value, but because they remove uncertainty. And once uncertainty disappears, innovation tends to accelerate. That's exactly what we've seen throughout history. The internet, smartphones, online banking, every major technological shift followed a similar pattern. Slow adoption at first, then suddenly widespread integration. And many people believe blockchain technology is approaching a similar moment because the infrastructure is being built right now, not someday, not years from now, right now. And that's why so many XRP supporters remain focused on utility instead of short-term price movements. Because while markets move up and down, development continues. And Ripple doesn't appear to be building for yesterday's financial system. They're building for tomorrow's. But here's where things get really interesting. Because building the infrastructure is only one part of the story. The second part is understanding what happens when that infrastructure is finally used at scale. And that's where many investors believe the biggest opportunity exists. Think about it this way. Throughout history, the people who benefited the most from major technological revolutions were usually not the people who arrived after everyone else understood what was happening. They were the people who recognized the trend early, before mass adoption, before mainstream attention, before the headlines started talking about it every single day. And that's exactly why so many investors continue paying close attention to developments happening around XRP, Hedera, XLM, and other networks focused on real-world utility. Because these networks aren't simply trying to create another speculative asset. They're building infrastructure. Infrastructure designed for payments. Infrastructure designed for tokenization. Infrastructure designed for settlement. Infrastructure designed for the future digital economy. Now, does that guarantee success? Absolutely not. Every investment carries risk. Every emerging technology faces challenges, and no one knows exactly how everything will unfold. But what many investors find encouraging is the direction of development, because every major update seems to point toward the same destination: more tokenization, more institutional adoption, more digital identity solutions, more decentralized finance, more blockchain integration into traditional finance. And when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it becomes easier to understand why so many large institutions continue positioning themselves for what comes next. Because they aren't investing billions of dollars based on social media hype. They're investing based on where they believe the world is heading. And that's an important distinction. Many retail investors focus on headlines. Institutions focus on long-term trends. Many people focus on daily volatility. Institutions focus on infrastructure. Many people focus on fear. Institutions focus on preparation. That's why one of the biggest lessons investors learn over time is to pay attention to behavior rather than words. Because behavior often reveals what people truly believe. And right now we're seeing massive resources being committed toward blockchain infrastructure. We're seeing governments discussing regulations. We're seeing banks exploring tokenization. We're seeing financial giants preparing digital asset strategies. And we're seeing companies like Ripple preparing the XRP Ledger for technologies that may not become mainstream until years from now. That tells a story, a very important story. Now, another topic that deserves attention is strategy. Because let's assume for a moment that many of these predictions eventually become reality. Let's assume blockchain adoption continues growing. Let's assume tokenization expands. Let's assume digital assets appreciate significantly over time. What happens next? Well, that's where many investors make mistakes. Because accumulating wealth and preserving wealth require completely different skill sets. Most people spend years learning how to buy assets. Very few spend time learning how to protect what they've built. And history shows this repeatedly. Lottery winners, athletes, entertainers, investors, people receive large amounts of money and then lose most of it within a few years. Not because they lacked opportunity, but because they lacked planning. They lacked discipline, and they lacked a strategy. That's why many experienced investors constantly talk about education. Not because it's exciting, but because it's necessary. Understanding taxation, understanding risk management, understanding legal structures, understanding market cycles, understanding when to take profits and when to stay patient. These things matter. Because eventually every investor reaches a point where protecting gains becomes just as important as creating them. And that's one reason why many successful investors emphasize preparation before success arrives. Because when opportunities appear, emotions tend to take over. Excitement takes over, fear takes over, greed takes over, and people often make decisions they later regret. That's why conviction is so important. But real conviction doesn't come from watching videos. It doesn't come from following influencers. And it doesn't come from copying someone else's portfolio. Real conviction comes from understanding, from research, from experience, from taking the time to learn why you're invested in something. Because when your conviction belongs to someone else, it disappears the moment they change their opinion. But when your conviction is built on your own knowledge, it becomes much stronger. And that's exactly why so many investors continue spending time learning about blockchain technology, tokenization, regulations, and digital finance. Not because they know exactly what will happen tomorrow, but because they want to understand where the world may be heading over the next decade. The reality is simple. The financial system is changing. Technology is changing. Markets are changing. And Ripple appears to be preparing the XRP Ledger for that future long before most people realize it's arriving. Whether it's quantum-resistant security, whether it's real-world asset tokenization, whether it's decentralized finance, or whether it's enhanced privacy solutions, each new development seems to point toward the same conclusion. The future digital economy is being built right now, and many investors believe we're still in the early stages of that transformation. So while most people remain focused on short-term price action, others are paying attention to the infrastructure being built underneath it all. Because in the end, that's often where the biggest opportunities are found. Thank you for watching today's XRP update. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss future XRP updates. And as always, I'll see you in the next update.